Berlin, 1948. A city divided by zones and habits of caution, where tram lines stopped short and stairwells smelled of coal dust. In these streets, hunger moved quietly, and people learned to read the sky as carefully as a timetable. Officials spoke of orders and obligations, while residents counted briquettes and watched for news that rarely clarified the future. An invisible ring tightened around daily life, and choices shrank to small calculations. Which room to heat, which errand to delay, which rumor to ignore. The story you are about to hear may reflect fragments of many accounts gathered in that unsettled year. It draws on records, memoirs, and reports that vary in detail and emphasis. Names of offices and exact procedures are kept at a distance to avoid claims that cannot be fully verified from a single vantage point. What follows is a dramatized reconstruction grounded in the known arc of events between 1948 and 1949, presented with care for plausibility and restraint. It aims to convey how survival might have felt at street level and how policy might have sounded behind closed doors. The focus is the city itself, its rooftops, courtyards, and long lines at distribution points, where the air gradually became the only open road. This program is speculative in its scene setting, yet anchored in the widely acknowledged outline of the blockade and the flights that followed. It offers no verdicts, only a measured look at endurance, intent, and the narrow path that kept a city breathing. By the early summer of 1948, Berlin felt like an island held in place by habit and resolve. Streets, once noisy with carts and bicycles, took on a thinner sound, as if the city spoke in whispers to avoid attracting the wrong kind of attention. Newspapers carried phrases that sounded firm but vague, and residents tried to piece together their own sense of the situation from small signals: a shuttered checkpoint, a timetable that no longer matched the day, a familiar route now blocked without explanation. The rhythm of home life changed first. Families closed off rooms to conserve heat, turning apartments into narrow zones of use. Kitchens became planning tables where portions were measured with care that bordered on ceremony. In courtyards, neighbors exchanged short nods, then traded small items that stretched supplies by a day or two. Coal bins taught their own accounting, and the stove, stubborn in the morning, answered only after a long pause. Public spaces reflected the same strain. The tram stalled, then stopped. The market stall's cheerful banter turned clipped, the display grew sparse, and the seller's shrug became a daily punctuation. People queued with an air of resigned choreography, moving when called, holding ration cards like fragile declarations of intent. Conversation avoided big claims. Some said the blockade might loosen once tempers cooled. Others suspected the pressure would increase until someone conceded. The safest remark was simply that tomorrow would look much like today, except perhaps a little thinner around the edges. In offices where documents stacked up and phones rang less often, clerks learned to keep their voices level, answering only what was asked. The city's administrative pulse slowed, not enough to stop, but enough to remind everyone that even routine could be rationed. If you walked along the canals, you noticed their silence most. Barges no longer slid past with the lazy confidence of a workday. The water became a mirror for the sky, reflecting clouds that seemed to move with exaggerated calm. At the cargo yards, rails rested without the usual metallic chatter, and the absence of motion felt louder than any horn. Every route that once linked Berlin to the surrounding countryside now raised a question, and most answers ended with the same word: blocked. At the apartment level, timekeeping shifted to what could be acquired, rather than what could be done. A loaf meant one plan, a scoop of coal meant another. Children adjusted faster than adults, learning to hold back questions even as they developed new games from whatever could be spared. Indoor voices grew softer. Outdoor steps became brisk and deliberate to save energy. People learned to balance effort against return, a calculation repeated in dozens of small decisions each day. There were signals of calm as well. Certain offices hung on to a reassuring tone, insisting that patience and careful management would see the city through. On some corners, a cafe kept a stool or two free, a gesture of normalcy that many appreciated, even if the coffee tasted of compromise. Human routines proved stubborn in the best way. Greetings at the stairwell, brief exchanges in line, a folded paper shared across a table. The city did not dramatize itself. It simply reduced its volume and carried on. Yet beneath the surface, a second conversation persisted, marked by careful phrasing and raised eyebrows. Some believed the blockade tested resolve rather than supply. Others thought it pushed administrative lines to reveal who would bend first. Those ideas were aired quietly, not to provoke, but to prepare for outcomes that could tilt without warning. The unspoken fear was that isolation might harden into permanence, turning an emergency into a new normal. In that climate, the first distant engines were noticed less as a promise than as a question. Residents had not forgotten the sound of aircraft from earlier years. Now the hum drifted back with a different intent that few dared name. People lifted their heads, shaded their eyes, and said little. You cannot declare a lifeline from a single noise, especially in a city trained by experience to be cautious. Still, attention shifted upward. If roads and rails were political sentences, the sky looked like a clause not yet closed. The blockade restricted what could enter by ground and water, but it could not erase altitude. That fact, obvious and fragile at once, encouraged a kind of patience that felt new. In the hallways of authority, meetings stretched, and statements grew carefully phrased. Outside, a pattern of waiting took hold, a shared awareness that the city's answer, if it came, might follow a route that did not touch the soil at all. Berlin held its breath and listened longer to the air. When the first sustained pattern of flights appeared, it did not announce itself with celebration. It arrived as repetition, and repetition became reassurance. The city learned the new rhythm slowly, then clung to it. People who had once flinched at the approach of engines began to measure time by their passage. Courtyards filled with faces tipped upward, not in spectacle, but in practical curiosity. Would the routes hold? Would the intervals shorten? Would the system, if that word even applied, keep its promise for another day? On the ground, the practical adjustments multiplied. Streets leading toward open fields saw more foot traffic at certain hours. Children counted minutes between approaches and swapped observations that sounded like weather reports. Adults tried not to turn every sound into hope, yet found themselves doing so anyway. The city's dry air, cut by prop wash and brief gusts, added grit to the senses, but people accepted it as part of the exchange. Authority framed the effort in phrases about coordination and duty. Residents used humbler language. They said that the sky had opened, that a door no one could lock had been found, that the city could now reach for supplies without stepping beyond its borders. No one pretended this was simple. Each delivery had to pass from air to earth, and that moment when potential turned into something you could carry or burn or eat carried both relief and risk. Occasionally word spread of disruptions. A route became crowded. A descent looked uneasy. A schedule slipped. The city learned to balance gratitude against realism, praising what worked while admitting what might falter. The air became a contested space of interpretation. Some observers suggested the flights were as much a message as a method, a way to show that commitments would be honored in practice rather than only in speech. Others cautioned that no supply chain could withstand indefinite strain and that delays might accumulate into greater uncertainties. The truth, if it could be called that in the moment, lay in the sight of goods appearing where they were needed most. A sack on a stoop, a crate that made a room warmer by night, a line that moved faster than expected because someone, somewhere, kept the interval tight. These small proofs added up to a city-sized argument for persistence. The effect on morale was visible in gestures too minor to enter official reports. Windows opened a little longer in the afternoon. A few shops rearranged their shelves to suggest choice, even when selection remained thin. People smiled with the tightness of those who knew luck could reverse, yet smiled nonetheless. A shared vocabulary formed, grounded in signs rather than slogans, the steady drone overhead, the idle crane finally swinging, the broom sweeping dust from a threshold before the next arrival. Doubts did not disappear. They found new shapes. Some asked whether the volume of deliveries could keep pace with the city's needs. Others wondered if the effort signaled a long contest in which living day to day would become the central tactic. A few speculated that diplomacy might respond to proof on the ground, softening a line drawn too hard. Since confirmation rarely traveled faster than rumor, people relied on familiar signal checks, 2 newspapers in quiet agreement, a slightly more confident tone in an official note, a radio voice that sounded less constrained. Meanwhile, the city adapted its routines. Work crews organized to move goods quickly. Courtyards saw orderly handoffs that looked almost ceremonial in their efficiency. Families adjusted meal times to the flow of availability, making a habit of careful substitution. Coal, when present, became a shared currency of warmth and patience. Food, when obtainable, spread across tables with the restrained joy of a festival in miniature. The city rediscovered modest celebrations that asked little and offered calm. There were inevitable setbacks. A day with fewer flights produced a nervous quiet that no official sentence could smooth. A night disturbed by unfamiliar patterns raised questions too broad to answer. Yet the overall arc suggested determination, visible not only in engines and schedules, but in the bearing of those who kept receiving what arrived. The sky had turned into a corridor. Everyone understood that corridors could be blocked, yet this one seemed to widen with use. Each successful transfer strengthened a habit of belief that the next one would follow. With time, the flights took on the character of civic infrastructure, as essential and unremarkable as a street lamp in working order. People could almost ignore them, were it not for the unspoken knowledge that their absence would mean a rapid slide back toward shortage. In that tension, the city learned a lesson about dependence without humiliation. Pride did not vanish. It evolved into gratitude practiced with composure. Neighbors helped without ceremony. Officials avoided triumphal language and, when possible, let outcomes speak for themselves. A sense emerged that Berlin was no longer simply enduring, but learning how to live within a pressure that refused to lift. The sky, once the city's most feared horizon, had become its most dependable ally. That reversal did not erase hardship, but it gave hardship a structure people could manage. And within that structure, hope could breathe without drawing unnecessary attention to itself. As the months wore on, the benefits of the air bridge and its burdens grew together like intertwined threads. Success arrived with a cost that could not be ignored, and strain settled into every layer of the city's routine. Nights were lighter than they should have been, not by illumination, but by interruption. Sleep came in segments as engines traced their intervals, reliable yet insistent. In tenement stairwells, the echo of footsteps at odd hours signaled workers heading to meet a schedule that cared little for dawn or dusk. The city's patience, while impressive, was not infinite. It required cultivation, reminders, and small mercies to keep from fraying. Families felt the pressure most vividly in the domestic sphere. Fuel had to last, so heat remained selective and brief. Meals gathered the household for quiet accounting: what remained, what could substitute, what might stretch without weakening the next day. Parents worked to keep anxiety bland in front of children, transforming worry into tasks. Fold this, fetch that, watch the time for me. The new normal depended on intentional calm. Too much celebrating when deliveries were swift risked disappointment later. Too much gloom during a thin day risked sapping the will that made the next day possible. This cultivated steadiness became a civic skill, practiced without applause. Out by the receiving grounds, the rhythm felt different, like a workshop that never shut its doors. Men and women learned the choreography of unloading, stacking, and clearing, carrying out movements that appeared ordinary except for their repetition across every hour that mattered. Efficiency was not a slogan, but a posture, feet placed to avoid wasted motion, heads turned to anticipate the next call. There was pride here, but it preferred to stand in the background, letting the quiet speed of practiced hands tell the story. Setbacks occurred and were handled with the same restraint. A delay could ripple outward, tightening tempers and timelines in ways that only those on the line fully appreciated. An incident, rare but memorable, might cast a pall that took a day to lift. When those moments came, the city relied on a few trusted indicators to regain its balance. a return to familiar intervals, a small increase in visible stock, the calm cadence of an official voice that refused to dramatize. Diplomacy continued elsewhere, as elusive in effect as it was precise in language. Statements passed through newspapers and bulletins with a tone that seemed designed to confirm little and reassure only what had already been accepted. The population grew skilled at parsing the speech for signs of change. A softer verb here, a broader phrase there. None of it could be counted on, yet the cumulative impression mattered. People believed that if the flights persisted, negotiations would have to reckon with the facts on the ground, or more accurately, the facts in the air. Among residents, a cautious philosophy took shape. Survival was no longer a cliff-edge act, it was a path edged with uncertainty, but a path nonetheless. You could plan a week with a straight face. You could ask a neighbor to trade later rather than immediately. You could show a guest the corner of a room that stayed warm for a full hour and feel that you had offered real hospitality. Culture shifted in small expressions of care. A borrowed pot returned cleaner than it arrived. A newspaper passed hand to hand with an agreed order of reading to reduce wear. A bit of laughter surfaced now and then, brief and careful, when a queue moved more quickly than expected. No one called these outcomes victories. They were simply corrections against fatigue. The city's spirit did not become triumphant. It became methodical, yet method carried its own risk. Routine can dull awareness, and there were days when the flights felt like weather, present but taken for granted. Those were the moments when a missed interval threw the city off balance, reminding everyone that this arrangement was, at heart, a delicate bargain between will and circumstance. Some observers worried about what might happen if the air suddenly fell silent. Others argued that the very continuity of the effort made such silence less likely with each passing week. The most credible signs remained practical. The flow remained steady, and the ground crews improved their craft to meet it. The human cost, while not always visible, was cumulative. Shoulders ached with a stubborn certainty. Tempers occasionally shortened, then apologized. The city learned to rest in fragments, to celebrate in brief nods, and to mourn in silence when required. Meanwhile, the idea of Berlin as a test site for endurance gained quiet acceptance. Not a stage for spectacle, but a place where resolve was measured in day-to-day competence. If there were alternative readings, suggestions that the massive effort served political ends as much as humanitarian ones, the city acknowledged them with a shrug and returned to its tasks. People did not deny layered motives. They lived with them. What mattered most was that the air remained open, the routes held, and the measured descent of each aircraft turned uncertainty into items that could be stacked, counted, and shared. As autumn hinted at colder nights, preparations took on a deeper seriousness. Windows were sealed with care. Stockpiles, such as they were, gained a more strategic arrangement. A household might shift furnishings to center warmth where the family gathered, reshaping the map of the home to match the map of necessity. Churches and halls offered spaces where neighbors could warm themselves for an hour without expenditure. These were not solutions. They were buffers. Buffers in a season like this could mean the difference between strain and crisis. Through it all, the horizon kept its role as a living barometer. Engines rose and fell, and the city listened with an ear tuned to nuance. Was the tone stable? Were the patterns familiar? Had the wind changed in a way that might complicate the schedule? This kind of listening became second nature, a civic sense that required no instruction. It bound people together without demanding speech. In that shared attention, the city found a form of solidarity that avoided slogan and ceremony alike. It was simply the habit of thousands holding a common line. We will note what arrives. We will move it where it needs to go. And we will meet tomorrow with the same steady hands. While engines mapped careful paths above Berlin through late 1948 and into 1949, the other contest unfolded behind doors that clicked shut with practiced restraint. The language of communique stayed measured, but the pauses between key words seemed to lengthen. In sector offices, attachés arrived with folders that looked identical from a distance. Notes were exchanged, then exchanged again, refining points until sentences said only what could be defended in public. The city felt these movements indirectly. 2 newspapers carried similar phrasing on the same morning, and that small alignment acted as a signal that something had shifted, if only by a degree. In corridors where clerks sorted dispatches and logged visitors, people learned to speak carefully about outcomes. No one promised relief, no one admitted stalemate. The safest description was that positions were under review. On the ground, residents watched for practical signs that words might be turning toward action. A checkpoint that had looked tense grew slightly less so. A patrol changed its pace. These were not declarations. They were the kind of adjustments that could be denied if questioned, yet they added up to a feeling that pressure might not be infinite. Meetings in Berlin relied on calendars that moved with deliberate caution. Delegations arrived, took their seats, and restated principles that had already been recorded in dignified language. What mattered was not the principles themselves, which were known, but the tone and order in which they appeared. A senior figure might place reconciliation before enforcement or insist on procedure before punishment. The order told its own story. There were moments when proposals seemed to reach the edge of agreement. Then the room would cool, and the papers would return to their briefcases. Observers spoke of leverage and face, of credibility tested not by speech, but by stamina. The air bridge gave stamina a tangible form. Each day that supplies reached the city, the argument that isolation would produce surrender became less convincing. Diplomats on one side could point to a population that was still standing. Diplomats on the other could claim that the flights proved the city could be sustained without concessions. Both readings coexisted in the same sentence. That duality allowed talks to continue without either side declaring defeat. The longer the pattern held, the more everyone understood that a negotiated turn would be judged by how it was presented as much as by what it contained. Public statements became artifacts to be handled with care. A single adjective could hint at a thaw, but only if it appeared in more than one place. Radio voices adopted a tone that was steady rather than bright. The message was that discussion continued, that responsibilities were acknowledged, and that practical steps were being explored. In private rooms, visitors from other capitals arrived to listen and to advise. They asked about routes, stockpiles, and the pace at which a city could manage its needs under strain. The answers rarely included numbers. They relied on descriptions of rhythm and tolerance that felt more honest than tables. It was said that a city living by the hour could also negotiate by the hour, not in a careless way, but in a way that made grand pronouncements feel risky. Within the western sectors, officials spoke of maintaining principles while avoiding provocation. Within the eastern apparatus, the blockade seemed tied to the belief that firmness could produce a recalculation. Neither side announced a limit to its patience, yet the city itself was an index. When streets stayed orderly and queues remained calm, it became harder to claim that the pressure was breaking civic order. At the same time, no one wished to admit that dependency on flights could be accepted as normal. The result was a delicate rhetorical dance where both parties avoided corners they could not back out from. The ground truth shaped this grammar. The air remained open, the corridors functioned, and the system on which the city now depended did not collapse. In this climate, small gestures grew consequential. A meeting extended by an hour. A phrase that once sounded like a threat softened into a conditional. Such details traveled quickly through offices and cafes, usually accompanied by a reminder not to overread the signs. After all, there had been disappointments. Both sides carried memories of talks that had seemed promising until a single sentence closed the door again. The residents of Berlin understood this pattern too well. They let the diplomats speak while they maintained their lines of daily survival. Winter pushed the issue forward with its own logic. Cold has a way of making timelines shorter. The urgency was felt across all levels, and it moved discussion out of abstraction. How long could this continue without an accident that altered the argument? How long before fatigue, not policy, forced a conclusion? Those questions did not appear in official papers, but they were present in every exchange that mattered. You could sense them in the way a pen paused over a draft before resuming. By early 1949, there were reports that channels outside the most visible tables were seeking formulas that allowed the blockade to end without forcing a public retreat. The idea was to replace pressure with procedure, to shift from a blunt barrier to a controlled arrangement that restored traffic under conditions everyone could read as a form of order. If that sounds imprecise, it was meant to be. Precision can expose weakness during a turn. The public heard only that consultations continued and that a next meeting was expected soon. Inside Berlin, the same two indicators kept people steady. Two newspapers that agreed in tone, and a guard posture that looked less severe than the week before. A city does not need access to secret papers to detect a change. It needs patience, habit, and an ear for small signals. In that sense, diplomacy shared a boundary with daily life. Both valued restraint. Both avoided statements that could not be kept. And both accepted that resolution, if it came, would be less a moment of triumph than a carefully arranged exit from a pressure that had simply run its course. The air bridge protected Berlin from collapse, but protection carried its own burden that settled into bones and routines. Waiting became a discipline taught by winter. People learned to anchor their days around predictable tasks and predictable silences. Morning began with a check of the stove and a glance at the sky. If clouds looked heavy, faces grew still as people reconsidered plans they had shaped around expected arrivals. The city had created a new calendar inside the old one. It measured time by intervals and thresholds rather than grand dates. The strain took ordinary forms that hardly appeared in reports. Shoes wore thin and were mended again. Coats hung near stoves to be warmed before use. Lines formed early so that the hours spent outside did not feel wasted, and neighbors rotated places so the oldest among them could avoid the harshest moments. In apartments, families used one room for living and one corner for rest. People spoke softly and saved their voices for the few conversations that mattered. A quiet philosophy took root. Do what can be done today. Arrange what can be arranged for tomorrow. Avoid promises that depend on luck. Schools adjusted in ways that proved how adaptable a city can be without fanfare. Teachers shortened lessons when rooms cooled too quickly. Assignments fit the realities of the home, where a desk might be a cleared space on a shared table and light might come from a window, not a lamp. Children became skilled at listening for signals that even adults missed. They could tell whether an interval overhead sounded normal. They could tell whether a neighbor's face hinted at thin news. They became guardians of household rhythm, not with solemnity, but with a practical sense that their part mattered. Work crews lived by a different clock. Their days were long, their breaks timed to movement rather than to comfort. They avoided waste in steps and in speech. Among them, a shared language developed that did not require many words. A nod meant adjust, a hand meant hold, a lifted chin meant ready. When setbacks came, they met them with a style the city had adopted as its own. They corrected course without drama, they absorbed delay without flattening morale, and they treated each safe completion as a reason to continue rather than to celebrate. Private worries remained private. This was not a city without grief, but grief stayed away from spectacle. When loss occurred, neighbors made space without asking for details. Food was left near a door. A message was carried so that a family did not have to explain itself several times. The human cost was less a single story than a field of small stories pressed close together. People avoided grand complaints because those led nowhere. They preferred to solve the problem they could reach with their hands. Health required more care than usual and had fewer options than comfort would allow. People rested when they could, ate when they should, and knew that even minor mistakes could drain energy they could not replace. Fear did not parade through the streets. It stayed in pockets and breathed through routine. Faith in a better day took the form of a clean table and a swept floor. Dignity meant being ready when help arrived so that help moved quickly to the next door. There were brief moments of relief that looked almost like normal life. A courtyard gathering where someone brewed a thin drink that still warmed hands. A birthday marked by a borrowed candle. A joke told quietly so that laughter did not travel and cause resentment in a line where others had less. These scenes did not deny hardship. They showed a city refusing to let hardship choose its entire vocabulary. People also found their limits and admitted them. A neighbor might ask to trade a chore because a cough had kept him awake. A parent might request a short leave from a task because a child needed attention. These were not failures. They were acknowledgments that endurance required honest accounting. The air bridge owed part of its strength to this honesty. It allowed the ground effort to match capacity to demand without the friction of pride. The soundscape of the city told its own story. Engines above, brooms on stone, the clink of a cup against a saucer, not because tea was plentiful, but because the ritual steadied hands. Even the silence had texture. It was the silence of people storing energy for a necessary hour. When spring approached, the human cost revealed another layer. The city had to relearn how to think beyond the immediate. This was not simple. Short horizons protect the mind during a season of pressure, yet they can narrow the imagination. People practiced small plans that extended a week or two. They considered projects that required patience. A window might be repaired rather than patched. A chair might be rebuilt rather than wedged. These were acts of recovery performed without language that announced recovery. Behind them stood a sober awareness that the strain had left marks that would not fade quickly. The body remembered. The mind remembered. But memory did not have to harden into bitterness. That choice rested in daily gestures more than in official speeches. The quiet heroism of Berlin was not a single dramatic act. It was the habit of households and crews to continue without flourish. It was the unadorned kindness of a neighbor who did not ask for a receipt. It was the line that moved because each person took only what was fair. By early 1949, the city could say that its people had carried a weight that might have broken them, and had carried it in a way that did not break their regard for one another. That sentence may read simple. It represented 1,000 decisions made each day in kitchens, on steps, and at gates. The cost was real. The patience was real. The balance would still need care tomorrow. Signals of change rarely arrive with banners. In Berlin, they appeared as small corrections that accumulated into expectation. By the opening months of 1949, the steadiness of flights had become a fact few contested. This did not mean the city relaxed. It meant that the balance had tilted away from crisis toward endurance. In that new light, certain gestures acquired larger meaning. A meeting notice used milder terms than before. A brief statement acknowledged the practical need to restore traffic under agreed conditions. 2 dailies published editorials that sounded less combative and more procedural. None of this amounted to an announcement, yet together, it suggested that the argument was shifting from whether relief would come to how it might be staged. On sidewalks and stairwells, people adjusted their hopes carefully. They expressed interest in a spring that might be less narrow than the last months. They did not declare the blockade finished. They allowed themselves to imagine an end that would feel more like a door sliding open than a wall falling. Work crews remained focused. Their ethic rejected premature celebration because celebration slowed hands. They had learned that rhythm protected the city. They kept the rhythm even when rumors gathered in warm rooms and pressed against windows like impatience. Those who tracked the diplomatic thread spoke of formulas under consideration. The language sounded technical without naming instruments. The idea seemed to be that ground routes could resume under supervision that satisfied the need for control while restoring a flow that neither side wished to police at enormous cost. The flights, by their plain success, had built an argument that isolation could not produce a concession worth the risk of continued strain. At the same time, no one wanted to concede that pressure had failed. The compromise would need to honor face while altering practice. Berlin understood the art of such arrangements. Its residents lived within them every day. The indicators people trusted remained practical. Trucks near certain crossings looked busy at odd hours. A gate swung with less friction than the week before, as if maintenance had returned where it had been withheld. The tone of a guard's voice lost its edge. These might have been ordinary repairs. In a city trained to read signals, they registered as preparation. The streets gave back their own hints. Market tables showed a wider range, modest but noticeable. A few items that had vanished returned with little comment. Buyers did not ask questions that might spoil the moment. They paid, nodded, and went home quietly, where someone would mark the change in a notebook that had kept a family honest for months. Discussion inside homes grew more forward-looking. People considered duties they had put aside. Repairs that had been delayed might be scheduled. Visits that had been too difficult might be attempted. Parents allowed themselves to answer a child's question with something other than "not yet." This was not euphoria. It was the easing of a held breath. Patience had been trained into the city. Now it sought a safe release. Officials in the western sectors also adjusted their language. They spoke more often about procedures, less about principle. In the east, signals suggested a willingness to move from blockade to regulation. Each step came wrapped in phrases that protected reputations. Each step also reduced the tension that had defined the city's life for months. The flights did not slow. Their continuity provided the stable floor on which negotiation could walk. The city, which had learned not to depend on announcements, watched the pattern and kept working. If a change came, it would be absorbed. If it did not, the habit of endurance remained intact. As spring approached, the air warmed slightly, and the sound from above altered with the season, not with policy. That fact calmed people in a way statements could not. Nature had returned to its ordinary authority. The city could afford to believe that politics might be encouraged to do the same. Then came a week when the signs grew clearer. A communiqué hinted that restrictions could be lifted under a set of reciprocal steps. Another paper repeated the phrase with the same order of words. In the places where goods were received, managers drew up tentative plans for a different pattern of work. They did this without fuss. If nothing changed, the papers would be put away. If something changed, readiness would be expected. Residents who had kept their emotions quiet allowed themselves the smallest of rituals. A window was left open for an extra hour. A table was set with more care than usual. This was not celebration. It was a recognition that survival might soon look less like a contest and more like a return to rules that could be understood without constant negotiation. In kitchens, people spoke in the conditional. If the route's open, then we will try this. If checkpoint's ease, then we will go there. They did not speak in absolutes because experience had taught them that absolutes turned brittle. The city had come this far by keeping its language flexible and its purpose firm. It would not abandon that balance at the edge of resolution. The horizon still held the sound of engines. The corridors in which diplomats moved still held their chill. Yet the space between the two felt different. It felt like the pause between tasks when a worker wipes a hand on a cloth and prepares for a new job. The blockade had taught Berlin to live inside tight limits. The hints of resolution suggested those limits might stretch. How far they would move remained to be seen. For now, the city stayed ready, watching for the day when the air would no longer be the only road it could trust. If relief arrived soon, it would not be an ending in the grand sense. It would be a shift in posture that allowed the city to return to habits that do not require constant vigilance. People would still count their briquettes and measure their portions, but they might do so with less fear that the sums would fail. Officials would still craft statements, but those statements might concern schedules rather than impasses. The air would lose some of its urgency and regain the quiet dignity of distance. A city shaped by constraint would face a new problem that felt almost luxurious. It would need to remember how to plan a month rather than a day. That change can be unsettling. It asks people to trust what they cannot see. It asks them to believe that corridors can stay open because they have been opened. The memory of strain would not vanish. It would sit in the body like a lesson learned earlier than anyone wanted. Some would argue the air bridge proved what commitment can achieve when expressed in steady action. Others might say it proved the limits of pressure when faced by disciplined patience. Both readings could be true without canceling each other. The record would remain incomplete because it would be written by many hands. As Berlin waited for the next notice, a simple question took shape in the quiet between flights. When the gates open and the roads fill, will the city move with the same care it learned under pressure, or will the old habits rush back and erase the discipline that kept it whole? The answer would not be given in a speech. It would be given by the way people lined up, by the way goods moved, by the way a neighbor knocked and did not need to explain why. The engine still hummed. The sky still carried its measured promise. The rest would be decided on the ground, one routine at a time.